Weapon stats and traits in Helldivers 2 are very interesting, to say the least. Every gun has their own purpose in the fight for freedom, and the UI menu stats can give you a very basic picture of what you can expect. But this doesn't truly tell the whole story, and even at times, this has actually been a bit misleading. In fact, according to Arrowhead's CEO, Johan Pilestad, weapons in Helldivers 2 apparently have something like 50 different types of traits that make each gun special. And look, I'm not a mathematician, but 50 seems pretty far off from like the 4 to 6 that we see in the weapons menu. So then what are all these missing stats, and what do they actually mean? Dr. Pooplove here, and that's what I hope to find out today. Let's get right into it. Okay, so to start off, I kind of want to talk about how I put this list together. I've tried to put as many weapon traits together as I can. Some of these are straight up spelled out for us in the menu. Others are pretty obvious, but they're not in your face. We have things from patch notes. We have things that the devs have said to us in conversations on Twitter or Discord. And we also have some that line up to stats and traits that we've seen in the original Helldivers game. Of course, there's also some educated guesses that I've included in here. We're going to try to get as close as we can to the roughly 50 and see if we can put this full picture together. Obviously, this isn't going to be 100% accurate. Unless the devs decide to tell us outright, it's probably going to be really hard to get the complete accurate listing. But hopefully I can get us close, and you can be the judge and let me know in the comments if you think I am missing anything. Now, the first two I want to go over are the two most basic weapon differentiators in this game, and that is weapon type and weapon category. And these are not necessarily detailed stats, but I do think they're important because they will generally define the parameters with which stats may end up sitting between for certain guns.
So the first one is weapon type, and this is the most basic level with 3 basic weapon types. You have primary weapons, which are meant to be always available to you and most commonly used. They're typically meant to be strong, but not able to effectively kill everything. You also have your secondary weapons, which are also always available to you, but meant to be more of your backup, weaker than your primary, but able to hold its own in a pinch. And then there are support weapons, which are stratagems meant to be called down via Hellpod and typically meant to be the most powerful and able to take out some of the most challenging enemies, or at least serving as some sort of a niche weapon. You will though lose these if you die, and so you'll have to pick them back up or call down via another stratagem. Now, going one step lower, we can look at the weapon category. And while these aren't really properly defined for secondary weapons, and support weapons seem more closely attached to their stratagem category, this is more clearly defined with your primary guns. You have assault rifles, which are typically full auto firing weapons with lower damage but higher fire rates. SMGs, you would think, are typically even faster firing with lower damage and maybe higher recoil to limit effectiveness at long range. This isn't maybe super true when you actually look at these two stats, but that's generally what you kind of would expect. You have marksman rifles, which are meant to be longer range, a little bit slower firing, but more impact, almost kind of more so your sniper type weapons. You have your shotguns, slower firing with less range but more impact and a wider spread. You have explosive weapons, which are meant to have some kind of impactful explosive trait attached to them. And then you have energy based, which is a little bit more unique with either laser or plasma or even arc type ammo. There may be more categories to come, and the devs may internally classify some of the support or secondary weapons under some of these either existing categories or new categories, but that hasn't been totally spelled out, so I won't go there. But from here, I think we can move on to the 4 basic stats that we see for most every weapon. And it is unfortunate that support weapons don't even have these listed, although they would have these stats as well. So the first of which is damage, and that's pretty much how much health you deplete per bullet, which is pretty standard. You have your capacity, and that's how many bullets are in your mag. Even though not listed here, you do have the number of mags, which ties very closely to capacity, and that's how many mags you can carry for each gun. Then you have your recoil. Now, recoil is basically how much your reticle will move and sway when firing and moving. The higher the recoil, the harder it is to stay on target. And then you have your fire rate. The fire rate is how many bullets you can get out of your gun gun over a specific period of time. Assault rifles will generally have higher, and shotguns will generally have less. Now, these are the ones you will most typically see, but there are also laser type guns which measure some different major stats. They have their damage per second, which is how much damage you deal over time. This is something you can measure for each gun, but definitely more required for something like a laser, which just deals a continuous damage for all targets in the vector. And you have your fire limit, which is how long you can hold down your laser before it overheats and requires you to replace the coil. Now, moving to the right side of the stats, we will see some of the special weapon traits that can give you a little bit more flavor as to the particulars of what makes each gun unique. And one of the major ones we'll see here is penetration. Penetration is typically defined in the weapon traits under either light armor penetration, medium armor penetration, and although it hasn't been listed yet, heavy armor penetration, which does exist, only in the support weapon category, which they don't really give you very good stat markers there. Bombs, though, also give you penetration levels, and the CEO has clarified a little bit about how this works. There are essentially 10 levels of armor that enemies have on various parts of their bodies, and a gun will have an armor penetration level that matches between 1 and 10. When the armor penetration number is lower than the armor number, it ricochets, which you will see with that non-hit marker. When the armor penetration level is equal, it ends up dealing 50% damage to the target, and that's where you will see those gray hit markers. And when your armor penetration is higher than the enemy, that's when you deal full damage with a red hit marker. Now, moving on to another common trait is one-handed, and this means that you can hold your weapon with one hand, which you might at first say, so what? But this does give you some key benefits. For one, this means that while you are running around, running away, you can fire backwards and in any direction without needing to turn around or slow down. And the other benefit is that you can use this with something like the ballistics shield. All secondary weapons do have this one-handed perk, and the SMG primary weapons do as well. Moving on to another trait is rounds reload. Typically, when you reload, you end up expending the rest of the bullets in the mag, but with this trait, you can basically reload at any time without losing ammo, and you will begin loading in bullets with the ability to stop that reloading at any time so that you can just start firing away. Now, the next trait isn't fully defined, but it has been noted in the patch notes with a particular weapon that does have rounds reload, the Senator, and that is a speed loader, which is basically a special reloading perk where once you've depleted your ammo to 0, it allows for a much faster reloading. Rather than having each individual bullet being loaded into the gun, you have a speed loader which loads all bullets at once and gives you that full reloaded weapon. Now, the next trait I want to talk about is kind of a weird one, and there's also many other traits that I think build off of this, and that is the explosive trait. Now, this trait has been confusing because it used to be listed for multiple guns that didn't seem to be producing any sort of actual explosion. And that's because I think this trait was initially trying to represent something else, which we will talk about, but the devs have since kind of reclassified why this gets listed, and it's basically guns that produce an AoE explosion. Essentially, this can be used to splash damage multiple enemies or create some damage beyond some armor levels that would otherwise be impenetrable, like how the Scorcher will provide damage to the Walker even though it doesn't have that armor penetration level to hit their faceplate. The extra explosive damage ends up getting to that rider and killing them anyways. Along with explosive, though, comes a few other traits. Two of these are kind of defined by what you'll see with throwables. So there's also this outer radius, and that is essentially how big the explosion is going to reach. Beyond that, based on patch notes, there's also an additional damage associated with that, as well as a damage drop off. So kind of adds 3 additional stats there. Also, as defined by the bombs, there's fuse time, which may not apply right now to many of the guns themselves, but I think it's still probably measured, at least in most part, with a measurement of 0. And this is essentially how long before the projectile is displaced and landed do you have before it blows up? Another thing I want to call out for an explosive trait is shrapnel, which was something that was in the Eruptor but has since been taken out. But this was essentially shrapnel pieces flying in all directions. And I initially thought that this meant this was a special trait that would close bug holes, but I think that is another trait in and of itself because the Eruptor still does close bug holes even though it doesn't have shrapnel. So being able to close bug holes and destroy factory vents must be related to some sort of trait in and of itself. That's why not all explosive weapons like the crossbow and the Scorcher cannot close bug holes, cannot shut down factories. But guns like the Eruptor, guns like the grenade launcher, guns like the grenade pistol all can. Now another thing to note along with explosive is what used to be the explosive perk that was listed, basically what it used to mean. And from discussions from the CEO, essentially what it seemed to mean was that it was essentially a damage multiplier that applied to enemies' weak spots, particularly weak spots that were sensitive to explosive damage, like the squishy weak spots on the back of the bile spewers. If you had this explosive multiplier trait, your gun would be able to dish out more damage to that weak spot. Additionally, with the chargers, but the same deal. I believe this is still happening, but now we don't really have any indicators of which guns have this or not. If your gun is producing an explosion though, this will apply. Next up, I want to talk about another trait that is explicitly listed, and that is Incendiary. Essentially, guns with this trait will deal fire damage, which basically means that it will deal a damage over time effect upon enemies. Bugs in particular seem to be particularly weak to fire damage, and so that's something to keep in mind with the traits. The next one I want to talk about is Beam. Now, this is a trait that is specifically for lasers, and it basically means that your gun will emit a continuous beam as you are shooting rather than an individual bullet. Moving on, we also have heat, which is almost a negative trait, I believe, but it is something necessary for energy-based guns, and that means that the gun produces heat, and as such, your weapon could overheat, and the coil might need to be replaced. This is the limiting factor on these guns, which otherwise would have infinite ammo. So basically, you need to have proper management of your heat levels as indicated in the coil bar in order to properly use these guns without ruining all your coils.
Another thing to go along with laser type weapons is recharge time, and this essentially is the time it takes for your ammo to recharge, like the quasar cannon, how long it takes before you can fire again, or how long it takes for your coil to cool off so that you can begin firing again.
Another explicitly defined trait is charge up. This essentially indicates that in order to fire your weapon, you will need to charge it up first. Typically, guns with this, you are holding the fire button and releasing for the projectile to release. This is what happens with your railgun, and this is what happens with the Plas Purifier. Now I want to talk about two traits that are specifically for support weapons, which I don't know if this would technically be considered a weapon stat, but they are differentiating factors that do make these guns unique, so it's worth mentioning, and it may be debatable as whether these count. So first, for all support weapons, you have Hell Pods, and this, as I said, isn't so much of a weapon stat, but basically this just means that equipping this weapon requires a Hell Pod being called down via Stratagem. Call down time will also play a factor here, as replacing a lost support weapon requires your Stratagem to cool down. And so if you think of it as like almost a cousin to reload time, then perhaps this is something that should be counted. You also have another thing, which is backpack reload or backpack ammo. Inherently, some weapons, at this point, Stratagem support weapons require special ammo that can only be reloaded from a separate backpack. You have the airburst, recoilless, the spear, autocannon. These all have their special backpack with their own special ammo. And this gets me to another very important weapon trait that isn't explicitly called out, but oftentimes you will see in the description of the guns. And that is the ammo type, which can also maybe be thought of as damage type as well. In this case, we're talking about plasma rounds, which typically will have an AoE explosion. We're talking about concussive rounds, which may cause a stagger effect. We're talking about jet propelled rounds. We're talking about arc, talking about laser. All these different ammo types offer their own unique traits, which also probably have other stats underneath them that are measuring different aspects of them.
There's also Demolition Force, which is called out in the patch notes, and what I believe this is the ability to demolish physical objects around the map, things like the side objective doors. And so this seems to be measured on its own basis. Another thing called out in the patch notes is damage to large volume bodies, and this I think kind of coincides with different body shot multipliers that guns may have. In particular, this seems to be called out for the laser cannon, but I would assume this is also a stat tracked for many other weapons.
Now, some of this coincides with general health of an enemy, but it does seem that maybe some guns have more impact than others on certain areas that extend beyond just armor level.
There also are stats for damage to durable enemy parts, which are essentially shielded or armored parts of an enemy that have their own health pools, and this kind of reinforces that just certain parts of enemies may take more or less damage based on multipliers that exist for a gun itself, beyond just the health of an enemy.
Now next I want to talk about lock-on, and this really only just applies to the spear, but this is the ability to lock on target well, if it works properly. Another one that I've seen get mentioned a lot, but it's not specifically called out, is Ergonomics. And the CEO himself actually showed an old screenshot which showed this. Essentially, I think this also ties into like the weight of the gun, the handling,
the rotation speed,
essentially how easy it is to wield this weapon. If you think about something like the Eruptor and the Jar, they're pretty heavy, they slowly rotate, you got to take some time to get on target, whereas something like the Pummeler, something like the Plaz Scorcher feels pretty snappy, feels like you can get on target very quickly, feels pretty light to hold in your hands. Now the next one I want to talk about is reload speed, and this may tie into other things like when you have a bolt action rifle, you're sort of like reloading between each shot, so that plays into it, but essentially every weapon has their own reload speed, and that is going to impact gameplay as well.
Another thing to think about here is actually reload pattern, and that is essentially what it takes for your character to reload that gun, which may not make a huge deal, but in certain cases, like especially with support weapons with their own backpack ammo, they sometimes have a reload pattern that must take effect in order to reload the gun. And in some cases, they actually occur in phases, so you can actually do a partial reload, stop that process, and then continue that process at a later point, essentially pausing the reload at each phase.
Another thing you have is muzzle velocity and or projectile speed, and I believe these are actually two separate things. They have been called out in the patch notes separately, but I think they kind of all relate to generally the speed of the bullet that's traveling. Muzzle velocity being kind of how fast it comes out from the length of the gun up to the end of the muzzle, and projectile speed kind of being more so the speed as it travels across distance. And some guns definitely fire faster than others. In particular, the crossbow fires very slow, so slow that you do have to kind of lead your shots with that in order to get on target. Another thing to consider is weapon modification, whether a gun is able to be modded, and in particular, if you want to go down even further, it's the fire mode that's available to that gun. If you have a gun that can be modified to semi-auto, burst firing, and full auto, then those are special traits in and of itself because other guns may not have those. You also have your scope type. Some guns have like this small circular type scope, while others have this big almost sniper style scope, and that definitely impacts things because of how zoomed in you're going to be in first person. There also are scope zooms. A lot of guns that have scopes have the ability to zoom them in at multiple distances, which of course has another impact on things.
Another thing is your third person mode reticle. Most reticles have these two horizontal lines with a circle in the middle, but others have a triangle, and still yet others have no reticle at all. It's unclear to me what kind of difference this
really makes for the gun, but the visual difference definitely is there and can have an impact on gameplay. Another thing to consider is range, because not all guns actually can fire forever. The Eruptor, for instance, will explode after it hits a certain range. Other guns like the Plasma Punisher just can't fire that far because it shoots in an arc pattern, which is another stat, which is bullet drop off. Whether your bullet will generally stay on the target you aimed at over a long distance, or whether it will start to fall down with gravity taking effect. And how severe is that? You also have damage over distance, because some bullets lose some of their damage as they travel longer distances. And I have heard that plasma guns actually have sort of the opposite effect, where the damage actually increases the further away the target is. Although I haven't really been able to verify that, so if someone knows in the comments how to confirm this, please leave one below. Another thing kind of touched on earlier is Stagger, which relates to concussive rounds, providing a level of stagger or stun to an enemy to stop them in their tracks and freeze them in place. There's also the ability to Collateral. Are you able to fire your bullet and have it penetrate through the enemy and hit another enemy behind it? Maybe more related to armor penetration levels, but it's still a stat in and of itself. You have Spread, something a little bit more useful for a shotgun, where even if you're not completely directly on target, you may get some grazing damage. Another thing to think about is pain wobble. A lot of times if you're being fired at or damaged, your reticle will fly up and down, and the pain wobble that you have may add an extra increase to the recoil and your ability to essentially get back on target. This may play as part of ergonomics, but I'm not sure. We'll also say safe mode. I mean, the railgun itself has a safe and an unsafe mode. Most other guns do not have this option, but it wouldn't be unusual to expect that another gun may have an unsafe mode as well. And this is basically the ability to kind of overcharge your weapon and maybe even cause yourself damage in the process. Also kind of related to charge up is essentially time to fire or charge up time. I'm thinking in this vein, something like the sickle doesn't immediately start firing out bullets. You're not necessarily charging and releasing that. Instead, you sort of need a little bit of time to charge up the gun to get it to fire. So I think this would be a separate type of stat. You also have things like sound. Certain guns seem to produce less sound than others, which has an effect on your ability to stealth or not. If you have a gun that's louder, probably not going to be able to stealth very well, but there are guns where you can shoot at enemies and the other enemies around it won't really detect it. Another thing to consider, maybe not now, but in the future, would be something like melee damage of each gun, in particular if they ever decide to add bayonets, something that was a part of Helldivers 1. Another thing is bounce or ricochet. Some bullets will bounce off of things and either hit yourself or hit other enemies. And then there also may be other stats related to things like EMP and related to gas and related to smoke. I think these haven't been fully fleshed out, but these are other either damage or effects that we do see in things like stratagems, like the gas strike stratagem. There's probably reason to believe that eventually we may get things like gas guns, like EMP guns, things of that nature, which may give us more insight into maybe what kind of stats are related to any of these damage types or effects. And so these are a lot of the traits that I think are coming into effect when we think about this game. It's why when you look at the very basic stats that we get to see, why that doesn't tell the full story, and why we really should be testing out these guns a little bit more to understand what other impacts based on a lot of these other traits are involved. But what do y'all think? Do you think that I missed some of the traits that are available to us? Let me know in the comments and we can kind of keep trying to compile and have a much better understanding of what are all these traits. And I want to say a special thank you to my YouTube members for joining the Bowel Movement. But otherwise, so long, Pooper Troopers.